The air in the vestry of St. George's was thick with the scent of old floor wax and the suffocating incense of a high society wedding. Nathaniel Westbury, the Duke of Somerset, stood by the stained glass window. His gloved hands clenched so tightly behind his back that the seams of his coat groaned. He looked every bit the Golden Duke, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of a new sovereign, but his face was a mask of cold fury. "You are certain?" Nathaniel's voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The maid found the note an hour ago, your grace," the Earl of Lennox stammered, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Arabella is— she has fled, with the music master." They took the light chaise. Nathaniel turned. The scandal would be absolute. The king was in the front pew. The Prime Minister was in the second. If he walked out there and announced he had been passed over for a man who taught the harpsichord, the Somerset name would be a punchline for the next century. "Then it is over," Nathaniel said, his voice clipped. "Call the carriage. I will make the announcement, and— No." The word was quiet, but it cut through the Earl's whimpering like a blade. A woman stepped out from the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. Lady Tabitha Lennox looked nothing like her sister. Where Arabella was soft and blonde, Tabitha was sharp lines and dark, observant eyes. She was dressed in a travelling suit of charcoal wool, her hair pinned back with a severity that spoke of her years in country exile. "Tabitha!" the Earl gasped. "What are you doing here?" "You were told to stay in the loft until the ceremony was concluded." "I'm saving our necks, father," Tabitha said. She walked toward Nathaniel, her gaze never wavering. She didn't look at him with the fluttering eyelashes of a debutante. She looked at him like a general surveying a battlefield. "The veil is thick enough, your grace. It belonged to our grandmother, yards of Brussels lace. No one can see the face beneath it until we reach the altar." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting a fraud, Lady Tabitha. A legal farce." "I'm suggesting a solution," she countered. She stepped closer, into the light of the window. "Arabella has ruined herself, but she hasn't ruined the Lennox dowry. The lands in Kent are still mine to bring. The alliance your father brokered remains intact. All you need is a woman of the correct bloodline to say, 'I do. I am that woman.'" Nathaniel took a long, slow step toward her. He was a head taller, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "And why would you do this?" "You were sent to the north for 3 years because you refused to obey your father. Why submit now?" Tabitha tilted her chin up. A small, bitter smile touched her lips. "Because in the north I learnt what happens to women who have no protection and no name." Outside, the organ began to swell. The processional had started. 30 seconds, Nathaniel," she whispered, using his Christian name for the first time. "A daring, calculated strike. Either you take my hand and we survive this, or you walk out there alone." Nathaniel looked at the door, but with the grip of a man claiming a prize he hadn't bargained for. "Get the veil," Nathaniel commanded the Earl, his voice like iron. "Tell him there has been a change in the paperwork. A clerical correction. You will have your title, Lady Tabitha. I want your signature, nothing more. Now help me with these pins." Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp stone and old parchment. He did not look at the couple. "The names, if you please," the bishop said, his voice brittle, as they appear on the amended license. Nathaniel stepped forward first. He picked up the quill, his movements precise. He dipped the nib, the scratching of the feather against the paper, the only sound in the room. Nathaniel Arthur George Westbury, Duke of Somerset. He set the pen down and stepped back, his jaw so tight a muscle leaped in his cheek. He didn't look at Tabitha. He looked at the Earl of Lennox, who was currently leaning against a stone pillar, looking as though he might vomit on the vestry floor. "Lady Tabitha," the bishop prompted. Tabitha moved to the desk. Her silk skirts hissed against the floorboards. She picked up the same quill, still warm from Nathaniel's grip. She didn't hesitate. Her signature was bold, the loops of the L sharp and uncompromising. "Tabitha Ann Lennox." "It is done," the bishop murmured, closing the book with a heavy thud. He looked up then, his eyes travelling from the Duke's icy stare to Tabitha's defiant expression. A word of counsel, Your Grace. A marriage built on a foundation of such sudden convenience requires more than just a signature to survive the winter. I did not pay for counsel, my lord, Nathaniel snapped. He turned to the Earl. The carriage is at the side door? Scarce, the Earl stammered, looking at the floor. The luggage was moved an hour ago. No one saw. They think it is Arabella's trunks. It doesn't matter whose name is on the leather, Tabitha said, her voice cutting through her father's panic. She turned to Nathaniel, her chin tilted up. The world saw me walk out of that church. The secret is no longer about who is in the carriage, but why she is there. Nathaniel finally looked at her. His eyes swept over her, the dark hair, sharp cheekbones, the wedding ring that looked too heavy for her hand. The secret, Nathaniel said, stepping close enough that only she could hear him, is how long I can keep from strangling your father for this catastrophe. Move, Tabitha. We have a gauntlet to run. He didn't offer his hand. He simply turned and headed for the narrow side exit, leaving Tabitha to gather her heavy skirts and follow him into the grey light of the afternoon. The carriage door slammed shut with a definitive, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the small, velvet-lined space. Outside, the muffled cheers of the crowd and the frantic barking of the Earl's hounds faded as the driver cracked the whip. The carriage lurched forward. For a long minute, there was only the sound of the wheels on the cobblestones and the rhythmic swaying of the chassis. Nathaniel sat on the forward-facing seat, his top hat resting on his knee, his gaze fixed firmly out the window at the passing grey stone of London. Tabitha sat opposite him, her stiff silk skirts taking up most of the floor, her hands folded over her silver-threaded evening bag. The silence was a living thing, cold and sharp. "You're bleeding," Nathaniel said. She realized she had been clenching her hands so tightly that her nails had punctured the skin of her palms. "It is nothing," she said, her voice matching his for coldness. "A small price for a dukedom, wouldn't you say? You have saved my reputation today. But you have also shackled me to a woman I do not know, a woman my own father-in-law saw fit to exile to the wilderness for 3 years. I am not my sister," she countered, her chin tilting up. "If you wanted a decorative doll who faints at the sight of a smudge on her glove, you should have chased the music master's carriage. Arabella is soft. I am not." Clearly. Nathaniel leaned forwards, the space between them shrinking until she could smell the faint, expensive scent of his bay rum and the metallic tong of the rainy afternoon. "But not soft is a far cry from Duchess. My mother will be waiting at Somerset Park. She has the instincts of a bloodhound and the mercy of a guillotine. If you slip once, if you use the wrong fork or fail to name the 4th Earl of Kent, this entire charade collapses." Tabitha didn't flinch. Nathaniel stared at her, his jaw tightening. He looked as if he wanted to yell or perhaps throw her out of the moving vehicle. How should the journey continue, revealing that he might be just as much of an outcast as she is? The carriage pulled into the courtyard of the Stag's Head well after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a rhythmic drumming against the leather roof. The innkeeper was already at the door, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. A duke and his new duchess were the prize of a lifetime for a roadside inn, and he was determined to earn a legendary tip. "Your Grace, a private parlour has been prepared, and the bridal suite has been aired for your arrival." The man beamed, ushering them inside. Nathaniel stepped into the flickering light of the hearth, his hand gripping Tabitha's elbow with a firmness that suggested a warning. "Dinner in the parlour," Nathaniel commanded, his voice projecting the weary authority of a man who had spent the day celebrating. "And we are not to be disturbed. The Duchess has had a long day." Once the servants had scurried out, leaving a tureen of soup and a bottle of wine, Nathaniel bolted the door. The click of the lock sounded like a gavel. He stripped off his heavy overcoat and threw it onto a chair. Tabitha remained standing by the fire, her hands outstretched to the flames. The steam began to rise from her damp silk skirts, smelling of wet roses and expensive desperation. "One bed," Tabitha said, her voice small but steady. She didn't look at him. The innkeeper mentioned a bridal suite. He expects us to share it. Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of wine, his movements jagged. He expects a duke to bed his duchess. He does not know he has housed 2 enemies under a flag of truce. He handed her a glass, his fingers brushing hers. He didn't pull away this time. I will take the settee in the dressing room. The heat of it hit her empty stomach, making her head swim. You hate me, she stated. It wasn't a question. Without the veil, she looked younger. And I hate that I find myself admiring the way you lied to the bishop. It wasn't a lie, Tabitha snapped, her eyes flashing. I said I will, and I meant it. I will be your duchess, Nathaniel. I will run your houses, I will bow to your mother, and I will produce your heir if that is what the contract demands. But I will not be hated for being the only one who stayed to help you when everyone else ran. Nathaniel set the glass down. Do I even know why you were sent to the north, Tabitha? Tabitha's breath hitched. He told you I was headstrong, that I refused a suitor, a girl who throws away a legacy for a moment in the dirt. Tabitha's hand flew out, the slap echoing in the quiet parlor. Nathaniel's head jerked to the side. He didn't move to touch his face. He slowly turned back to her, a red mark blooming on his cheek, his expression unreadable. The stable boy was my cousin's groom, Tabitha whispered, her voice trembling with a rage 3 years in the making. My father sent me away because a Lennox woman wielding a blade is unstable, while a man beating an animal is just disciplining. Believe what you want, your grace. But do not call me a fool for love. The tension has shifted. The room fell into a heavy, vibrating silence. Tabitha did not lower her head, nor did she offer a single word of defense. She stood with her chin tilted, her chest heaving against the restrictive boning of her corset, her eyes burning with a silent, searing defiance that seemed to dare him to speak again. Nathaniel did not touch his cheek. He watched her for a long moment, the red imprint of her palms stark against his skin, before he slowly turned toward the table. Sit, he commanded. The word wasn't a plea. It was the reassertion of his rank. We have a 3-day journey ahead of us, and I will not have you fainting from hunger before we reach the county line. Eat. He pulled out a heavy oak chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. Tabitha hesitated, then moved with a stiff, rustling dignity to take the seat. Nathaniel sat opposite her, ignoring the soup and pouring himself a second glass of wine with a steady hand. My anger at your family's deception has not cooled, Tabitha, he said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical tone. Your father has sold me a bill of goods that was not as advertised, and you have participated in a fraud that would see us both in the Tower if the king were in a less forgiving mood. But the ring is on your finger, the ledger is signed. We are now a singular entity in the eyes of the law. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. Somerset Park is not a playground, he continued, his gaze pinning her to her seat. It is a machine. It supports 3 villages, 4 mines, and 1,000 tenants. My father left the estate's liquid assets in a state of creative disarray. Arabella was chosen because her dowry was meant to clear the mortgages on the northern acreage. Since you have brought that same dowry, you will now bring the labor required to justify it. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the tabletop. You will be expected to manage the internal accounts, oversee the transition to the new tenant laws, and, most importantly, navigate my mother. She is the dowager, and she does not tolerate incompetence. You will memorize the Somerset lineage. You will learn the names of every head of household on our lands, and you will never not once give the impression that you are anything other than the woman I chose above all others. He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving hers. The heat of his earlier outburst had been replaced by a chilling, bureaucratic resolve. You wanted a title, Tabitha. You have it. But do not think for a moment, because I apologized for a slander. I have surrendered the lead. I am the Duke of Somerset. You are my Duchess. You will perform your duties to the letter, or you will find that the exile your father imposed was a mercy compared to the one I supply for a wife who fails me." He pushed a plate of bread toward her, his expression unreadable. "Now eat. We leave at dawn." The morning light was grey and thin, filtered through the heavy mist that clung to the courtyard of the Stag's Head. Inside the carriage, the air was chilled, smelling of damp leather and the faint, lingering scent of the lavender water Tabitha had used to wash her face at dawn. Nathaniel sat opposite her, a leather-bound ledger open on his knee. He had intended to begin the morning with a brisk, distant lecture on the Somerset lineages, but as the carriage jolted into motion, he found his gaze snagging on his wife. In the harsh, honest light of day, Tabitha was not the shimmering, ethereal diamond her sister had been. She was something more substantial. Her dark hair was pinned with a precision that bordered on severe, highlighting the elegant, sharp line of her jaw and the hollow of her throat. There was a pull to her, a dark, quiet magnetism that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. He cleared his throat, forcing his eyes back to the parchment. "My mother, the Dowager Duchess, is a woman of the old world," Nathaniel began, his voice sounding raspier than he intended. "She believes a duchess should be a pillar of the community and a fortress of the home. She will test your knowledge of the family tree back to the War of the Roses. She expects you to know that the third Duke died at Agincourt, and the fifth was a confidant to Elizabeth I." Tabitha listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't look out the window. She watched his mouth as he spoke, her dark eyes tracking every word with a focus that Nathaniel found increasingly distracting. "The fifth Duke," Tabitha said, her voice low and thoughtful. "Was he the one who expanded the East Wing, or the one who lost the Somerset jewels in a wager with a French envoy?" Nathaniel paused, surprised. "The latter. How did you know that?" "My father's library was the only place I was allowed to spend my time before the incident," she replied simply. "I read the peerage records." "But tell me about the East Wing. If the estate's liquidity is as strained as you suggested last night, was the expansion truly paid for, or is there a hidden debt associated with the stonework?" Nathaniel felt a reluctant spark of interest. It was an intelligent question, a practical one. Most women of her station didn't understand the difference between an asset and a liability. "The debt was settled 3 generations ago," he explained, leaning forward, "but the maintenance is a parasite. It costs more to heat that wing than it does to run the home farm. My mother insists on keeping it open for guests, despite the fact that we haven't hosted a royal visit in 20 years. Then we must find a way to make it productive," Tabitha mused. "Or convince the Dowager that a closed wing is a sign of exclusive privacy rather than poverty. Style can often mask a lack of substance, can it not?" Nathaniel's gaze lingered on the curve of her lips. She wasn't a hothouse flower, delicate and easily crushed. She was a night-blooming jasmine, something stronger, deeper, and far more dangerous to a man's resolve. He snapped the ledger shut, the sound sharp in the quiet carriage. "Let us move to the cousins," he said, his voice tightening as he fought to regain his professional footing. "There are 3 who believe they are next in line for the title should I fail to produce an heir. They will be looking for any sign of weakness in you. Any hint that you are not the perfect bride I claimed you were." "Then we shall give them no hints," Tabitha said, her eyes meeting his with a steady, dark intensity. "Tell me their names. Tell me their debts. I want to know exactly who is waiting for us to fail." Nathaniel began to list the names, but, as he spoke, he found himself wondering if the real danger wasn't the cousins at all, but the woman sitting across from him and the way his pulse jumped every time. The carriage bumped and brought her silk skirts brushing against his boots. The second night of the journey found them at the George, a coaching inn of slightly better repute than the last, though the constraints remained the same. The innkeeper, flush with the prestige of housing a duke, had bowed them into the only superior chamber available, a room dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in heavy crimson damask. Dinner was served in the small parlour attached to the bedroom. The fire crackled, casting a warm amber glow that softened the harsh lines of Nathaniel's face. He had spent the day hammering facts into Tabitha's mind: the Somerset acreage, the names of the parish vicars, the intricacies of the 1815 Corn Laws. Tabitha sat across from him, sipping a glass of dark claret. She had been a perfect student, her questions cutting through the fluff of aristocratic tradition to the bone of the estate's survival. "You mentioned the enclosure of the common lands near the village of Oakhaven," she said, her voice quiet. "If the tenants are losing their grazing rights, their resentment will fall on the new Duchess first. It is a social debt, Nathaniel, not just a financial one." Nathaniel paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, really looked at her, over his glass. The candlelight caught the depths of her dark eyes, making them appear like velvet. She wasn't just memorizing names. She was building a defense for his legacy. "You are right," he admitted, his voice losing its serrated edge. "It was a decision made by my father's executors. I have been occupied with the debt he left behind. I had not considered the optics of the village square." Tabitha set her glass down. For the first time, she didn't look at him with defiance, but with a guarded, grudging respect. "You have carried the weight of this dukedom alone since you were 24. It is no wonder you look for enemies in every shadow, even in your own carriage." The air in the room shifted. The hostility that had defined their wedding day was beginning to settle into a weary, mutual recognition. "I have had little choice," Nathaniel murmured. He watched the way the firelight played across the curve of her shoulder. She was beautiful, but it was a haunting, dark beauty, the kind that belonged to moonlit gardens and whispered secrets. He found himself wanting to reach across the table, not to command her, but to see if her skin was as warm as the hearth. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "The hour is late. We have a long pull tomorrow to reach the Somerset border." The transition to the bedroom was silent. The maid had already turned down the covers and left a single warming pan between the sheets. There was no bolster tonight. The bed was wide, but the intimacy of the room felt suffocatingly narrow. Nathaniel removed his coat and waistcoat, his movements slower than the night before. He watched Tabitha behind the silk screen as she moved, her silhouette cast large against the wall. When she emerged, she was wrapped in a high-necked nightgown of white lawn, her dark hair unfurled and cascading down her back like a silken river. It was a sight that made his throat go dry. "I will stay to my side," he said, his voice a low rumble as he climbed into the left side of the bed. Tabitha slid into the right, the mattress dipping under their combined weight. She lay on her back, staring up at the shadows of the bed canopy. The heat from his body was a physical presence, a hum of energy that made her pulse skip. "Nathaniel?" she whispered into the dark. "Yes? The cousin? The one with the gambling debts in London? Lord George? If he approaches me at the homecoming ball, I shall tell him the Somerset accounts are being audited by the Crown. It will keep him from asking for a loan for at least a season." Nathaniel let out a short, huffed breath that might have been a laugh. He turned onto his side, looking at the dark outline of her profile. "You are a terrifying woman, Tabitha." "I am a duchess," she corrected softly, "and I am yours, for better or worse." In the silence that followed, Nathaniel didn't move away. He stayed close enough to feel the warmth of her breath, wondering when the woman he had been forced to marry had become the only person he felt he could actually trust. The third day brought a treacherous stretch of road through the high, lonely moors of the Peak District. The mist had swallowed the horizon, turning the jagged limestone outcrops into ghostly sentinels. Inside the carriage, the lessons had finally tapered off into a weary, mutual silence. The peace shattered with the sharp, rhythmic gallop of horses approaching from the rear, not the steady pace of a stagecoach, but the frantic, heavy beat of several riders at full tilt. A shout rang out, followed by the terrifying crack of a pistol shot. The carriage lurched as the driver hauled on the reins, the horses screaming in protest. Nathaniel was thrown forward, his hand catching the leather strap to steady himself. He didn't reach for a ledger this time. He reached into the concealed side pocket of the carriage door and pulled out a heavy, silver-mounted flintlock. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register Tabitha had never heard. "Behind the seat. Now." The carriage door was ripped open from the outside. The cold moor air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of wet wool and black powder. A man stood there, his face obscured by a rough charcoal neckerchief, a rusted pistol levelled at Nathaniel's chest. "Out, both of you," the highwayman barked. "The jewelry, the purses, and the ladies' rings, or I'll paint this velvet red." Nathaniel stepped out first, his movements slow and deliberate, keeping his own weapon hidden in the folds of his greatcoat. Tabitha followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her silk skirts dragging in the mud. 2 other riders circled them, their horses huffing steam into the grey air. "The Duke of Somerset, is it?" the leader sneered, eyeing the crest on the carriage door. He lunged forward, reaching for Tabitha's shoulder. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He didn't fire the pistol, it was a single shot he couldn't afford to waste yet. Instead, he swung the heavy butt of the weapon, catching the man squarely in the jaw. The highwayman crumpled into the muck with a sickening thud. The other 2 riders reacted instantly, levelling their carbines. "Nathaniel!" Tabitha shrieked. As the second man squeezed his trigger, Nathaniel threw himself backward, his weight slamming into Tabitha to knock her out of the line of fire. They hit the saturated earth together. The ball whistled through the space where his head had been a second before, splintering the carriage's wooden frame. Nathaniel rolled, coming up on one knee. He levelled his flintlock and fired. The second rider clutched his shoulder and tumbled from his saddle, his horse bolting into the mist. The third man, seeing his companions down, yanked his reins and fled into the fog, his hoofbeats fading into the distance. Silence returned to the moor, broken only by the heavy breathing of the Duke and the soft sound of the wind. Nathaniel stood up, his face splattered with mud and black powder soot. He didn't look at the fallen men. He turned frantically to Tabitha, who was pushing herself up from the wet grass. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip almost painful in its intensity. He began checking her arms, her neck, her face, his hands trembling with a frantic, raw energy. "Are you hit? Tabitha, look at me. Did the ball strike you?" "I am fine," she gasped, her hands clutching his mud-stained lapels. "Nathaniel, your arm, your coat is torn." "To hell with the coat," he rasped. He pulled her against him, his face burying in the crook of her neck. The Duke was gone. The lecture was forgotten. He held her with a desperate, crushing strength, his heart thundering against her own. "I thought... when he reached for you, I thought I had failed you." Tabitha didn't pull away. She leaned into the solid heat of him, her fingers tangling in the damp hair at the nape of his neck. The man who had been a cold stranger 2 days ago was now the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. "You didn't fail," she whispered, her voice steadying. "You saved me." Nathaniel pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were wide, dark with a terrifyingly honest emotion. He reached up, his muddy thumb brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. For a moment, the masks they both wore, the Duke and the disgrace, slipped entirely. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he promised, his voice a low, fierce vow. "Not a highwayman, not my mother, no one." The final inn before the Somerset border was a far cry from the draughty roadside taverns of the previous nights. The Royal Oak was a place of polished brass, thick carpets, and a staff that moved with terrifying efficiency. They arrived looking like survivors of a war. Nathaniel's coat was ruined, his cravat was gone, and Tabitha's gown was stained with the dark peat of the moors. The innkeeper's eyes widened, but a sharp look from Nathaniel and a heavy purse of gold stifled any questions. "We have 12 hours," Nathaniel said, the moment the door to their private suite was bolted. He paced the length of the room, his boots clicking on the parquetry. "By noon tomorrow, we will be at the gates. We cannot arrive looking like we were ambushed by common thieves. It suggests weakness. It suggests we are not in control." Tabitha stood by the window, watching the rain wash the mud from the carriage outside. "And your mother smells weakness like a hound smells a fox." "Exactly." Nathaniel stopped his pacing and looked at her. He didn't see a disgraced exile anymore. He saw the woman who hadn't screamed when a pistol was leveled at her head. We must reconstruct the image. I have sent the valet to the local dressmaker. Luckily, Somerset Park's influence extends this far. They will bring whatever they have in silk and velvet. You will choose the most understated regal gown available. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. The air in the room, once cold with mutual loathing, was now taut with a different kind of tension, one of shared secrets. "Now," he said, the final drill. "My mother's name is Eleanor. She was a Howard before she married my father. She values 3 things: lineage, composure, and the preservation of the Somerset reputation. If she asks why you are here instead of Arabella, what is our story?" Tabitha turned to face him, her expression shifting instantly. Her eyes smoothed over into a serene, slightly bored mask of aristocratic grace. Arabella's nervous collapse was so severe that the physicians feared her future mental stability. As the elder sister, it was my duty to step into the breach to ensure the Lennox-Somerset alliance remained unbroken. I did not do it for love or for a title. I did it for the honor of both houses. Nathaniel nodded, a slow, appreciative gleam in his eyes. "Good. And if she mentions your ... time in the north?" "I was sent to tend to our ailing aunt and to oversee the northern accounts," Tabitha replied without missing a beat. "A quiet life of service and study. I find the gossip of the ton quite tiresome in comparison to the rigors of estate management." "Perfect." Nathaniel reached out, his hand hesitating before he settled it on her shoulder. His thumb brushed the base of her neck, just above the collar of her ruined dress. "You are a formidable woman, Tabitha. I find myself regretting that I spent the first 2 days of this journey trying to break your spirit instead of enlisting it." Tabitha looked up at him, her mask slipping just enough to show the pulse racing at her throat. "Perhaps you needed to know I wouldn't break, Nathaniel. A duke needs a duchess who can stand beside him, not behind him." He didn't pull away. For a long moment, the lessons were forgotten. The upcoming battle with his mother, the ruined carriage, the lies all faded behind the weight of his hand on her shoulder. "We are a team now," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before he caught himself. He cleared his throat and stepped back, regaining his composure with visible effort. "Go. The dressmaker's here. Scrub the more from your skin and put on the silk. When we walk up those stone steps tomorrow, they will see a duke and duchess who have been in love since the moment they met." Tabitha curtsied, a perfect, graceful movement. "As you wish, your grace." As she moved toward the dressing room, Nathaniel watched her, his jaw set. He had spent his life preparing for a marriage of convenience. He hadn't prepared for a wife who was his equal in every way that mattered, and he certainly hadn't prepared for the realization that the substitute was the only woman he ever wanted in his house. The fire in the suite's hearth was a roaring, confident gold, a stark contrast to the grey, hostile mist they had left behind on the moors. After a dinner of roast duck and fine hock eaten, in a silence that felt heavy, not with resentment, but with the shared weight of the coming dinner, Daniel poured 2 glasses of amber brandy. He handed one to Tabitha. She was wrapped in a borrowed robe of heavy forest green velvet, her dark hair damp and hanging in a thick, loose braid over one shoulder. She looked smaller like this, away from the silk and the corsets, but her eyes remained as sharp as a falcon's. "You've been quiet since the highwaymen," Nathaniel said, settling into the armchair opposite her. He swirled the brandy in his glass, the light catching the shifting amber liquid. "And don't tell me it is fatigue. You have more stamina than my best hunter." Tabitha took a slow sip, the heat of the spirit blooming in her chest. She looked into the flames. "I am thinking about the stories we tell. You asked me earlier why I didn't scream when that man leveled his pistol at us." "It is a question that has been bothering me," Nathaniel admitted, leaning forward. "Most ladies of the ton would have been in a dead faint. Even Arabella would have been hysterical. But you looked at him like he was a nuisance. Like the groom with the pipe." Tabitha's mouth tightened. She set her glass on the small side table and finally looked at him. "My father didn't send me away because I was unstable, Nathaniel. He sent me away because I saw him for what he was." The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. Nathaniel waited, his gaze unwavering. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. Nathaniel waited, his gaze unwavering. "My father had ordered him to break her spirit because she was too temperamental for a lady to ride. I found them in the barn at midnight. The groom was a brute, yes, but he was following the Earl's orders." Nathaniel's grip tightened on the stem of his glass. "When I stepped in with the knife, it wasn't a girl's tantrum," she continued. "I told my father that if he ever touched anything of mine again, I would do more than just nick a groom's arm. I told him I would go to the local magistrate and tell them exactly how he'd been mishandling the Lennox." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "So he fabricated the story of the stable-boy lover. He sent me to the north to be forgotten until he needed to trade me like a commodity." Nathaniel felt a slow, cold fury rising in his throat, not at Tabitha, but at the man who had sold her to him. He realized now that the diamond Arabella had been the favorite because she was easy to control, while Tabitha was a threat to her father's crumbling facade. So when the highwayman stepped out, Nathaniel murmured, "It wasn't the first time you'd faced a thief who wanted to take what was yours." "No," Tabitha said, her eyes meeting his with a piercing honesty. "But it was the first time someone stood in front of me to stop it." Nathaniel stood up. He walked to her chair and reached down, taking her hand in his. He didn't pull her up. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the knuckles he had watched clench in terror and defiance all week. "I am sorry," he said, and for the first time the apology wasn't uncomfortable or stiff. It was a vow. "I thought I was the one being cheated in this marriage. I didn't realize that I was getting a true partner, and you had been robbed of everything." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "My mother will try to find the cracks in your story, Tabitha. But she will not find them, because I will be standing in front of you. And if your father ever thinks to darken the doors of Somerset Park to ask for a favour, he will find the Duke of Somerset has a very long memory." Tabitha's fingers curled around his. The grudging respect had finally irrevocably turned into something deeper. "We arrive tomorrow," she whispered. "Tomorrow," Nathaniel agreed, his voice a low, warm rasp, but a quiet, burning acknowledgement that they were no longer strangers. The limestone towers of Somerset Park loomed against the pale sky, a sprawling testament to 4 centuries of cold, aristocratic power. As the carriage crested the final rise of the 2-mile driveway, the massive estate stretched out like a sleeping beast-grey stone, leaded glass, and endless acres of manicured emerald lawn. Inside the carriage, the air was electric. Nathaniel sat forward, his gaze fixed on the house, his hand resting firmly on the silver head of his cane. He was dressed in a suit of charcoal wool so sharp it looked like armor. Opposite him, Tabitha was transformed. The disgraced sister was gone, buried under layers of midnight blue silk and a high collar of Alençon lace. Her hair was swept into a complex, shimmering crown, and her expression was one of cool, untouchable serenity. "The staff is assembled," Nathaniel noted, his voice low. "The dowager does not believe in private homecomings. She wants a spectacle." "Then we shall give her one," Tabitha replied. She reached out and straightened his cravata brief. Domestic gesture that felt more like a soldier checking a comrade's harness. The carriage ground to a halt at the base of the great stairs. 2 footmen in powdered wigs and gold and black livery snapped to attention. throwing the doors open. Nathaniel stepped out first. He did not immediately move toward the house. Instead, he turned and offered his hand to Tabitha with a slow, deliberate reverence. As she stepped onto the gravel, the line of 50 servants bowed and curtsied in a single fluid wave. At the top of the stairs, framed by the arched stone entrance, stood Eleanor, Dowager Duchess of Somerset. She was a pillar of black silk and obsidian jewelry, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it made her eyes look like those of a hawk. Beside her stood the estate's steward, holding a silver tray with the traditional keys of the household. "Keep your chin up," Nathaniel whispered as they began the long ascent. "She's looking for the Lennox tremor. Do not give it to her." They reached the top landing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the caw of a distant crow. "Nathaniel," the dowager said, her voice like dry parchment. She did not embrace him. She simply inclined her head. Her eyes immediately shifted to Tabitha, raking over her with clinical, soul-deep scrutiny. "And, Lady Arabella, you look different than your portrait, child. Darker, more substantial." The moment of truth had arrived. The staff held their breath. Nathaniel stepped forward, his hand sliding firmly to the small of Tabitha's back. "The portrait was a flattery of the girl she was, mother. This is the woman she has become. May I present Tabitha Ann, my duchess?" The dowager's eyes narrowed until they were mere slits. She looked at Tabitha, the name hanging in the air like a challenge. She looked at the way Tabitha met her gaze without blinking, her dark eyes reflecting the grey stone of the house. "Tabitha," the dowager repeated, the name tasting like vinegar on her tongue. "The elder sister, the one who was travelling in the north, the one who was managing the Lennox interests." "Your Grace," Tabitha corrected, her voice silk-wrapped steel. She stepped forward, closing the distance until she was mere inches from the formidable woman. "I find that Somerset Park requires a steady hand and a clear head for figures. I have spent my life preparing for such a task. I trust we shall find much to discuss regarding the tenant reforms." The dowager blinked. She looked at Nathaniel, who stood with an uncharacteristic, protective pride, and then back at the girl who had just bypassed the pleasantries to talk of land management. For a heartbeat, the entire social order of the county hung in the balance. Then the dowager reached out and took Tabitha's hand. Her grip was cold and incredibly strong. "You have your mother's eyes," Eleanor murmured, her voice losing a fraction of its frost. "And your father's stubborn jaw. It seems Nathaniel has developed a taste for something sharper than a diamond." She turned toward the door, her black skirts hissing. "Come inside. The tea is cold, and the accounts for the East Wing are in a shambles. Since you're so fond of figures, you may begin tonight." As they crossed the threshold into the cavernous great hall, Nathaniel leaned into Tabitha's ear. "You've won the first skirmish," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "I didn't come here to win skirmishes, Nathaniel," she replied, her eyes sweeping over the vast, cold beauty of her new home. "I came here to rule." The dawn light had barely touched the tapestries of the ducal bedchamber when Tabitha slid out of the heavy silk sheets. Nathaniel was still asleep, his features softened by a rare, unguarded exhaustion. She watched him for a heartbeat before she dressed with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. She did not call for the maid. She didn't want the performance to begin until she was fully armed. By 8 o'clock, Tabitha was standing in the centre of the morning room. By 9, she had summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, and the steward, Mr. Thorne. "Your Grace," Mr. Thorne began, his voice carrying a note of rehearsed condescension. "The dowager usually reviews the household ledgers on the first Monday of the dowager is no longer the mistress of this house." "Mr. Thorne," Tabitha interrupted. She didn't raise her voice, but she sat at the mahogany desk with such a natural sense of possession that the man's protest died in his throat. "I have reviewed the staff manifest. There are 32 servants in this wing alone. I want a full inventory of the silver, the linen stores, and the coal consumption for the last 3 winters by noon." Mrs. Higgins bristled. "The linen has been managed the same way for 40 years, Your Grace. Then for 40 years you have been losing money to damp and poor rotation, Tabitha said, her eyes meeting the older woman's with a level, dark intensity. I saw the stay of the North Gallery yesterday. There was dust on the baseboards and the scent of mildew in the drapes. From this moment forward, the Somerset Standard is not a suggestion. It is a requirement for your continued employment. She spent the next 4 hours moving through the house like a general inspecting a front line. She didn't just walk. She interrogated the architecture. She found the damp in the still room, the unauthorized waste in the kitchens, and the 3 footmen who thought they could lounge in the stables while on duty. By midday, the gossip below stairs had shifted from the substitute bride to the Iron Duchess. Nathaniel found her in the library, surrounded by towers of leather-bound ledgers. She had a streak of ink on her thumb, and her Ellington lace cuffs were pushed back, revealing the slender, strong wrists he had seen gripping the carriage strap during the robbery. The staff looks as though they've seen a ghost, Nathaniel said, leaning against the doorframe. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Mrs. Higgins tried to corner me in the hallway to complain that you've reordered the laundry schedule. The laundry was being washed with lye that was ruining the lace, Tabitha said, without looking up from a column of figures. I've changed supplier. I've also found that your head groom has been overcharging you for oats by 10% for the last 2 years. Nathaniel walked over, looking down at the neat, sharp lines of her handwriting. You've been Duchess for 5 hours, Tabitha. I have been a Lennox for 23 years, she countered, finally looking up. Her dark eyes were bright with the thrill of work. I told you I knew how to run a machine. This house is magnificent, Nathaniel, but it is leaking money through its pores. If we are to fix the mortgages on the northern acreage, we must first stop the rot in the cellar. The dowager appeared in the doorway then, her black skirts rustling like a warning. She looked at the open ledgers, then at Tabitha's ink-stained hand, then at her son. She has dismissed the head gardener, Nathaniel, the dowager said, her voice taut. The man has been with us since the Regency. He was selling your prize roses to the market in Oakhaven and pocketing the difference. Your Grace, Tabitha said, standing up to face the older woman. She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She handed a small slip of parchment to the dowager. Here are the receipts I found in his quarters. She has dismissed the head gardener, Nathaniel, the dowager said, her voice taut. The man has been with us since the Regency. He was selling your prize roses to the market in Oakhaven and pocketing the difference. Your Grace, Tabitha said, standing up to face the older woman. She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She handed a small slip of parchment to the dowager. Here are the receipts I found in his quarters. As his mother retreated, Nathaniel turned to Tabitha. The room felt smaller, charged with the same electric heat that had sparked between them in the carriage. You're enjoying this, he murmured. I am being useful, she corrected. There is a difference. Nathaniel reached out, his hand covering hers on the desk. He didn't care about the ink. I think, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp, that I may have accidentally married the most dangerous woman in England. Not dangerous, Nathaniel, she whispered, her fingers curling into his. Just determined. You gave me a home. I intend to make sure it's still standing in 100 years. The dining room of Somerset Park was a cavern of flickering candlelight and polished mahogany, the air heavy with the scent of roasted venison and the weight of expectant silence. 6 neighbours, the local gentry and a neighbouring viscount, sat around the table, their eyes darting between the Duke and his new dark-haired Duchess like spectators at a duel. The gossip had clearly arrived before the carriage had. The whispers about the Lennox switch were visible in the way the Baroness pouted and the way the men gripped their wine stems. And so, the dowager said, her voice cutting through the clatter of silver, we find ourselves quite settled. Though the change in arrangement was sudden, the results were most efficient. Sudden is one word for it. Lady Honoria, a sharp-featured woman in garish yellow, smirked. We were also prepared for the diamond's golden curls, to find a different sister entirely. It's quite the theatrical twist, isn't it, Lady Tabitha? Tabitha raised her wineglass, her expression cool. Life is rarely a staged play, Lady Honoria. But I find that those who focus too much on the castless often miss the quality of the performance. Nathaniel's hand moved under the table, his knuckles brushing against Tabitha's silk skirts in a silent show of support. But before he could speak, a peal of genuine warm laughter erupted from the end of the table. "Oh, leave her be, Honoria. You're just annoyed because you lost the betting book on which Lennox girl would land the Duke." The speaker was Lady Beatrice Cavendish, the Countess of Morley. She was a woman in her late 20s with a riot of chestnut curls and a face that seemed perpetually amused by the world's absurdities. She had been Tabitha's only confidant during their debutante season, before the exile. Tabitha beamed, raising her glass. "I'm so glad you are back, and I prayed to every saint that the rumours were true. The North hasn't dulled your tongue, I see." The speaker was Lady Beatrice Cavendish, the Countess of Morley. She was a woman in her late 20s with a riot of chestnut curls and a face that seemed perpetually amused by the world's absurdities. She had been Tabitha's only confidant during their debutante season, before the exile. Tabitha beamed, raising her glass. "I'm so glad you are back, and I prayed to every saint that the rumours were true. The North hasn't dulled your tongue, I see." Thank God, this county was becoming dreadfully boring. The table went still. B was the social heart of the district. Her approval was more valuable than gold. "Lady Beatrice," Tabitha said, a genuine smile finally softening the sharp lines of her face. "I see your husband still hasn't managed to teach you the value of a discreet silence." "He tried for a week, got a headache, and gave up." B winked at the Earl of Morley, who looked on with fond exasperation. She turned back to the table, her gaze sweeping over the judgmental faces. "I don't know what you're all gawking at. Tabitha was always the one with the brains. If Nathaniel wanted a pretty statue, he'd have stayed in London. If he wanted Somerset Park to actually turn a profit, he did exactly what any sensible duke would do. He married the woman who knows how to hold the reins." Nathaniel leaned back, his tension visibly easing. He looked at B, then at his wife. "Lady Beatrice has always been a woman of excellent discernment." "Indeed," B said, leaning forward and ignoring her soup. "Now, Tabitha, tell me everything. I heard a rumour you fought off 5 highwaymen with nothing but a parasol and a scathing look. Is it true, or was it 10? Tabitha chuckled, a low, rich sound that made Nathaniel's heart skip. "Only 3, B. And I let the Duke do the shooting. I was busy protecting my silk." The tension in the room snapped. Under B's breezy, defiant protection, the scandal of the switch transformed into an adventurous romance. The neighbours began to lean in, their suspicion replaced by curiosity. As the courses changed, B leaned closer to Tabitha, her voice dropping below the general hum. "They're all vultures, darling, but they're cowardly ones. Stay close to me. Keep that terrifyingly competent look on your face, and we'll have this entire county eating out of your hand by the weekend." Tabitha looked at her old friend, then at Nathaniel, who was watching her with an expression that was no longer guarded, but openly captivated. "I think," Tabitha whispered back, "I might actually enjoy being a duchess after all." The following week at Somerset Park was a whirlwind of calculated upheaval. Tabitha didn't just issue edicts. She appeared in the kitchens at 5 in the morning to watch the coal being weighed and walked the drafty servant. Corridors with a carpenter to mark exactly where the window frames were rotted. If they are well fed and warm, they will not steal, and they will not lag. The bed was a vast silken battlefield. Every night they lay in the dark, the bolster between them feeling less like a barrier and more like a lightning rod. One night, as the fire burned low, Nathaniel spoke into the shadows. "He also mentioned you bought him a new coat." Tabitha shifted, her silk nightgown whispering against the sheets. The man was shivering. "A cold groom is a careless one." "You are a liar, Tabitha," Nathaniel murmured. She heard him turn toward her in the dark. "You pretend this is all about the machine and the figures, but you have a heart that your terrified people will see. And you have a habit of watching me too closely. she retorted, her voice trembling slightly. It is hard to look away, he rasped. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the unsaid. Nathaniel reached across the bolster, his hand grazing her arm. It was a brief, searing contact that made Tabitha's breath hitch. He didn't pull away, and for a moment the business of the dukedom felt 1,000 miles away. Nathaniel, I know, he whispered, his voice rough with a hunger he could no longer mask. Sleep, Tabitha. Before I forget that I am supposed to be a gentleman. The arrival of Lady Beatrice the following afternoon was a welcome reprieve from the stifling intimacy of the bedroom. Be swept into the morning room like a gust of fresh air. Her bright muslin skirts a cheerful contrast to the sombre oak panelling. I've heard the news, Bea exclaimed, dropping into a chair and reaching for a lemon tart before the tea had even been poured. The housekeeper is telling everyone you're a saint. And the dowager looks as though she's sucked a lemon because she can't find anything to complain about. How on earth did you do it? Tabitha smiled, finally relaxing as she poured the tea. I simply treated the house like a ledger that needed balancing, Bea. Rubbish, Bea laughed, her eyes twinkling. You treated it like a home, and, speaking of the home, ... She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. How is the Duke? I saw the way he looked at you at dinner. Like a man who's suddenly realized he's stumbled upon a treasure map and isn't quite sure where to dig. Tabitha felt the heat rise to her cheeks. He is. Satisfied with the progress of the estate. Oh, hang the estate. Bea waved a hand. Is he satisfied with the Duchess? Because if that man isn't head over heels in love with you by the first frost, then he's a fool, and we both know Nathaniel Westbury is no fool. Tabitha looked down at her teacup, her voice softening. It is complicated, Bea. We started with such resentment. To admit to anything else feels like surrendering. Darling, Bea said, reaching across to squeeze her hand. In a marriage like this, surrender is the only way you actually win. Stop looking at him like a business partner and start looking at him like the man who fought a highwayman for you. The ledgers will still be there in the morning, but a look like that doesn't last forever if you don't feed the fire. Before Tabitha could respond, the door opened and Nathaniel stepped in. He stopped, his gaze immediately finding Tabitha. The raw, heavy look in his eyes made Bea's words ring in her ears. Lady Beatrice, he said, bowing slightly, though his eyes never left his wife. I hope you are encouraging my Duchess to take a rest. She has been working as if the devil is at her heels. Actually, Your Grace, Bea said, a wicked glint in her eyes. I was just telling her that some fires need more than just hard work to keep them burning. The following afternoon, the Dowager Duchess sent for Tabitha. The summons didn't come via a footman, but through a clipped, handwritten note. The solarium. 3 o'clock. Bring the quarter-year projections. Tabitha found Eleanor seated among a forest of ferns and winter lilies. The older woman was draped in black lace, looking every bit the frozen monarch of Somerset Park. On the wrought iron table between them sat a heavy, cream-coloured card embossed with the royal seal. Sit, Tabitha, Eleanor said, not looking up from her embroidery, and put those papers down. I've already heard from the steward that you've managed to find a surplus in the candlewax budget. I don't know whether to be impressed or insulted that we've been overpaying for tallow since the Regency. Efficiency is rarely an insult, Your Grace, Tabitha said, taking the seat opposite her. It is merely clarity. Eleanor finally looked up. Her eyes, usually as cold as flint, held a spark of something that looked dangerously like approval. Clarity. Yes, you have a great deal of that, perhaps too much for your own good. She tapped the invitation on the table. The Duchess of Devonshire is hosting a ball in 10 days. It is the first major event of the season, and as the new Duchess of Somerset, your absence would be a confession of scandal. Tabitha glanced at the card. A ball. A room full of the very people who had whispered about her disgrace for 3 years. I assume we are attending. We are, Eleanor said. But understand this. They will be looking for the Lennox girl who was sent away. They will be looking for a substitute, who is hiding in her husband's shadow. If you walk into that ballroom and look like a woman who is lucky to be there, they will tear you apart. The dowager leaned forward, her obsidian necklace clinking. I've already contacted the modist in London. I am not afraid of them, Your Grace, Tabitha said quietly. Good, because Nathaniel is, Eleanor countered. At Tabitha's surprised look, the dowager gave a thin, knowing smile. Oh, he isn't afraid of gossip. He is afraid of how much he has come to rely on you. My son has always kept his heart behind a stone wall, Tabitha. You've managed to climb over it, and now he doesn't know whether to hand you the keys to the fortress or double the guard. That night, the atmosphere in the ducal suite was taut. Nathaniel was standing by the window, a glass of brandy in hand, watching the moon rise over the estate. Tabitha sat at the vanity, unpinning her hair. My mother told you about the Devonshire ball, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. She did. She wants me to wear the emeralds. Nathaniel turned, his gaze raking over her in the mirror. The emeralds are a statement of war, Tabitha. If you wear them, there is no going back. You are telling the world that you are the Duchess of Somerset, and that anyone who speaks of the Lennox scandal answers to me. Tabitha stood, her hair falling in a dark silken wave over her shoulders. She walked toward him, stopping just a foot away. Is that what you want, Nathaniel? For me to be your Duchess in front of the world? Nathaniel set his glass down on the sill. The air between them hummed with the same friction that had been building since the highwaymen's attack. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. I want, he rasped, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register, for them to see what I see. A woman who is twice the match for any man in that room. But I also want to know that when the music stops, you are coming home to this room, with me. He pulled her closer, the distance between them vanishing. Tabitha didn't pull away. She leaned into the heat of him, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart. I told you once I was yours for better or worse, she whispered. The ball is just another ledger to be balanced. No, Nathaniel murmured, his head dipping toward hers. This isn't about ledgers anymore, Tabitha. And you know it. Nathaniel had been waiting at the base of the stairs for 20 minutes, but when the rustle of heavy silk finally announced her descent, the impatient remark he'd prepared died in his throat. Now, sitting opposite her as the carriage jolted toward the Devonshire estate, he couldn't stop staring. The Somerset emeralds were massive, old mine stones set in heavy gold, resting against the pale. Creamy skin of her throat like drops of frozen forest. The gown was a deep, dark blue silk that clung to her frame, making her eyes look like polished obsidian. You're staring, Nathaniel, Tabitha said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She was nervously smoothing the silk over her knees. I am assessing the investment, he rasped, his voice sounding lower than usual in the cramped space. He reached out, his gloved fingers catching hers. You look predatory, Tabitha, in the best possible way. Every man in that ballroom is going to wonder how they managed to keep you hidden in the north for 3 years. And every woman will be looking for the disgrace, she whispered. Let them look, Nathaniel said, his grip tightening. They'll find a duchess who could buy and sell their husbands before the first waltz is over. The dowager, seated beside Tabitha, cleared her throat. She had been uncharacteristically quiet since they left the house, her gaze fixed on the emeralds. You look exactly like her tonight, Eleanor said suddenly. The frost in her voice had thawed into something thin and bittersweet. Your mother, Mary. When she wore similar stones at her own wedding, she had that same look in her eyes, as if she were daring the world to try and break her. Tabitha turned to her mother-in-law, surprised. You knew her well? We were girls together, Eleanor murmured, looking out the window at the passing hedgerows. You look exactly like her tonight, Eleanor said suddenly. The frost in her voice had thawed into something thin and bittersweet. Your mother, Mary. When she wore similar stones at her own wedding, she had that same look in her eyes, as if she were daring the world to try and break her. Tabitha turned to her mother-in-law, surprised. You knew her well? We were girls together, Eleanor murmured, looking out the window at the passing hedgerows. Best friends, until your father took her away to that draughty pile in the Midlands. Mary was the fire of our season. She was brilliant, sharp-tongued, and far too clever for the man she married. The dowager turned back, her gaze softening as she looked at Tabitha. I never understood why your father pushed Arabella forward for Nathaniel. I suspect it was because Arabella is easy to ignore. He knew if he sent you, you would see through his financial discrepancies in a week. He didn't want a duchess. He wanted a distraction. But Mary would be proud of you tonight, Tabitha. She'd be glad to see her daughter finally sitting where she belongs. Tabitha felt a lump form in her throat. For years she had felt like an outsider in her own family, a problem to be solved. To hear that her mother, the woman she barely remembered, would have stood beside her changed the tilt of her chin. Thank you, Your Grace, she whispered. The carriage slowed as they entered the long torchlit drive of the Devonshire mansion. The sound of a full orchestra drifted through the night air, punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of dozens of arriving coaches. Nathaniel stood first as the door was opened by a footman in powdered white. He stepped out and turned, offering his arm to Tabitha. He didn't just wait for her. Positioned himself so that the light from the torches hit the emeralds and the sharp, proud line of her profile. "Ready?" he asked, his blue eyes burning with a fierce, protective pride. Tabitha took a steadying breath, placed her hand on his forearm, and stepped out into the light. "Ready." As they reached the top of the grand staircase, the majordomo's voice boomed through the ballroom. Cutting through the music and the chatter of 300 guests, the Duke and Duchess of Somerset. The sea of silk and lace below them parted. "Ready?" he asked, his blue eyes burning with a fierce, protective pride. Tabitha took a steadying breath, placed her hand on his forearm, and stepped out into the light. "Ready." As they reached the top of the grand staircase, the majordomo's voice boomed through the ballroom. Cutting through the music and the chatter of 300 guests, the Duke and Duchess of Somerset. The sea of silk and lace below them parted. The whispers didn't just stop. They were swallowed by a collective, stunned silence. The disgraced sister hadn't arrived in a shroud of shame. She had arrived like a conquering queen, flanked by a duke who looked ready to challenge any man who dared to blink. Tabitha didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, her hand firm on Nathaniel's arm, as they began their descent into the lion's den. The descent into the Devonshire ballroom was not a walk. It was a deployment. Every head in the room swiveled, the light from a dozen crystal chandeliers shattering against the Somerset emeralds. Nathaniel felt the tremor in Tabitha's hand, but her face remained a masterpiece of marble. As they reached the final step, the first to approach was the Duke of Devonshire himself, a man whose influence was second only to the king. "Somerset," Devonshire rumbled, his eyes lingering on Tabitha with unmasked curiosity. "A surprise to see you in town so soon. And this is the lady of the house." "My wife, Tabitha," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying just enough edge to signal a warning. "She has been occupied with the transition at Somerset Park. We found the country air much more conducive to our private celebrations." "The country air clearly agrees with her," a sharp, feminine voice cut in. Lady Honoria's cousin, the Marchioness of Roth, stepped forward, her fan clicking shut like a gunshot. "Though one wonders, Lady Tabitha, or is it Duchess now, how the North treated you. There were so many stories about your health during your stay in the Highlands." Tabitha didn't flinch. She allowed a small, pitiful smile to touch her lips. "The North is a place of great clarity, Lady Roth. It allows one to distinguish between those who are truly loyal and those who merely fill their time with the echoes of other people's lives. I spent my time managing accounts. It is a far more rewarding hobby than, say, embroidery or speculation." A few of the gentlemen nearby chuckled. The Marchioness flushed a mottled red. Nathaniel felt a surge of triumph so sharp it nearly made him laugh. The music shifted to a waltz. "Nathaniel, if you will excuse us, I'd like to dance with my wife." Smiling warmly, he led Tabitha to the center of the floor. As they moved, the world became a blur of spinning silk and whispered judgment, but within the circle of his arms, It was quiet. "You are doing it," he whispered, his hand firm at the small of her back. "They are afraid of you, Tabitha. Look at their faces. They expected a victim, and they found a predator." The music shifted to a waltz. "Nathaniel, if you will excuse us, I'd like to dance with my wife." Smiling warmly, he led Tabitha to the center of the floor. As they moved, the world became a blur of spinning silk and whispered judgment, but within the circle of his arms, it was quiet. "You are doing it," he whispered, his hand firm at the small of her back. "They are afraid of you, Tabitha. Look at their faces. They expected a victim, and they found a predator." "I don't want them to be afraid," she murmured, her eyes meeting his. "I want them to be certain that I am the only Duchess you will ever need." "I am already certain of that," he replied, and for a moment the ballroom vanished. As the dance ended, they were cornered by a familiar figure. The Earl of Lennox, Tabitha's father, stood near the refreshment table, looking pale and significantly older than he had a fortnight ago. He looked at Tabitha, his eyes darting to the emeralds on her neck stones he had once tried to claim for his own debts. "Tabitha," he stammered, "a word, if you please, in private." Nathaniel stepped forward, his shadow looming over the Earl. "Anything you have to say to my wife, Lennox, you say in front of me, or you don't say it at all." I only wanted to discuss the Kent holdings," the Earl whispered, his bravado gone. "There are some signatures required." Tabitha stepped out from behind Nathaniel. She looked at her father, the man who had exiled her, slandered her, and sold her. "The Kent holdings are now under the Somerset audit, father. My husband's stewards will be contacting yours by the end of the week. Do not expect any further signatures to cover your discrepancies." The Earl opened his mouth to protest, but Tabitha leaned in, her voice a low, lethal silk. "You sent the wrong daughter to the north, father. You should have sent the one who couldn't read a ledger. Now go. The king is in the next room, and I would hate for Nathaniel to mention the state of the Lennox trust funds to his majesty." The Earl turned and vanished into the crowd without another word. The journey back to the estate was silent, but it was a silence of completion. They arrived at dawn, the limestone towers of the house glowing pink in the first morning light. As the carriage stopped, Nathaniel didn't wait for the footman. He hopped out and reached for Tabitha, lifting her bodily from the carriage and setting her on the gravel. He didn't let go of her waist. He looked up at the house, then back at the woman in his arms. "The accounts are balanced," Tabitha whispered, leaning her forehead against his. "To hell with the accounts," Nathaniel rasped. He swept her up and carried her across the threshold of the great hall. The staff, already stirring, watched in hushed amazement as their icy duke carried his iron duchess up the grand staircase. In the privacy of their suite, as the sun broke fully over the horizon, Nathaniel unpinned the Somerset emeralds. "You saved me in that vestry, Tabitha," he said, pulling her into his arms. "But I think I've been waiting my entire life for a woman who could tell me no, because I intend to tell you no for the next 50 years. His lips meeting hers as the doors to the balcony blew open, letting in the fresh, clean air of a new Somerset era.
If you enjoyed my story, please consider subscribing and comment below where you are listening from. I read every comment. Until next time, keep smiling.